So, last week as we explored some of the Bleach manga's most controversial moments from its original run, I mentioned wanting to discuss the manga's ending in more detail. After all, it was the culmination of not just the Thousand Year Blood War arc, but the entire series. Over 15 years of near non-stop, diligent, creative work by Kubo to build and craft this story we all love, we all still love today, which in many ways is thriving in a way I hadn't seen for years just not too long ago. And the end of the Bleach manga meant different things to different people. I'd been reading the manga weekly for close to 10 years at the time, and had been making YouTube videos on it for about 4 since the start of the Thousand Year Blood War arc. The final chapter of Bleach, chapter 686, released in August 2016, and felt like the closing of a major chapter of my own life at the time. There was a point before that where I couldn't imagine a future without a new Bleach chapter releasing each and every week. It kind of felt like the end would never actually come, even with the announcement back in 2012 that the Thousand Year Blood War arc would indeed be the series' final arc. And yet, when that at one point unforeseeable future did finally arrive, truth be told, it arrived for me with something of a whimper, and ultimately felt far less impactful on my life and on me as a person, as a fan, than I could have ever imagined. Unfortunately, as has been well documented at this point, the ending of Bleach, well, it wasn't great, to cut a long story short. There were numerous factors involved in the way Bleach ended, not least of all Kubo's own ill health and mounting desire to wrap the series up quickly, and the entire thing fell, sadly, pretty flat, and certainly didn't feel indicative of any kind of vision of Kubo's. There's no sugarcoating it, I was very disappointed, and the ending was tough to stomach. I'll hold my hands up and admit I was pretty naive. I was an ardent defender of Kubo and Bleach right the way through to the very end, but even I was deflated in a big way once it was all said and done. Again, it's kind of quaint to look back on things like the ending of Bleach now. The series is in such a healthy position, and it does all feel a little bit silly, a little bit melodramatic, but that's just reflective of how much it all meant to me and how much it still does. So today I want to finally tackle the spectre of Bleach's ending. Why didn't it work? What went wrong narratively and why? But more importantly than that, more importantly than dwelling on the negatives, how can the Thousand Year Blood War arc anime fix the ending? What's it already done to help lay the groundwork? Optimistically, how can it use the manga as a springboard and finally deliver Kubo's original intended vision for the end of ultimately what's his life's work? Let's take a look. Of course, remember to hit subscribe down below if you enjoyed today's video and you want to see more, maybe not just like this, but more Bleach videos every single week. It really would help support the channel and I would appreciate it greatly. And of course, check out my Patreon as well. If you want to take support for the channel that extra step further, it really does mean a massive amount. And it is also helping out hugely, so thank you all so very much. And of course, there will be, obviously I would have thought, spoilers for the end of the Thousand Year Blood War arc and yes, the end of Bleach in the video to come. So, to begin, what actually happens at the very end of Bleach? The Quincy Blood War comes to a very abrupt ending in chapter 684, where after Uryu shoots Yhwach with the still silver arrow, Ichigo finally kills him with a single swing, putting a stop to the Quincy King once and for all. Or so it seems. After this, we are given a scant 2 chapters of epilogue to help wrap up not just the final arc, but the entire story to date. People often tend to forget that the Arrancar arc, which is to date the longest arc of Bleach, also ended in pretty much the exact same way, and also was looked upon pretty unfavourably back in the day, with only 2 chapters of epilogue there as well, to try and sum up over 200 chapters worth of conflict and content. The only reason I think that it's not quite so frowned upon anymore. It's because the Thousand-Year Blood War arc's ending came along to kind of take its place as a scapegoat. And also with the ending of the Thousand-Year Blood War arc, because it was the end of the series itself, there was always going to be that sense of missed potential, that sense of wasted potential, that sense of missing out on things that could have been. Something that the ending of the Arrancar arc simply doesn't have to deal with because there was more story to follow. Anyway, in regards to the epilogue, chapter 685 reveals that we have skipped ahead 10 years, leapfrogging the immediate aftermath of that entire battle, to instead see what the Gotei 13 is up to in the future. Kyoraku reveals that they have only just finished rebuilding the Serete, and we see that sweeping change is really the theme of this chapter as we herald a new age of the Gotei 13. There are numerous new captains. Isane is now the captain of Squad 4, while Iba is now the captain of Squad 7, and Mayuri has created a new version of Nemu. Meanwhile, Ukitake is revealed to have died as a result of the Kamikake ritual. Again, something that, while many people expected, was a little bit abrupt, a little bit unceremonious. All of the Shinigami, however, are coming together for a special occasion, the inauguration ceremony for Rukia's promotion to the captain of the 13th Division. Now, while Rukia's promotion to captain was very well received by fans and believed to be very well earned, sadly the same couldn't be said for the other two new captains at the time, Isane and Iba, neither of whom really seemed to quote-unquote deserve the position of captain and kind of felt like space filler in a new era of the Gotei 13, and that certainly didn't help things here in chapter 685. At the same time, Akon detects spirit energy that seems to match Yhwach arcs from over a decade ago, leaving us with one final cliffhanger. Then we have the very last chapter of Bleach, chapter 686. In Karakura Town, everyone is gathering at the Kurosaki Clinic to watch Chad's title fight as he's now a champion boxer. Well, everyone except Uryu, who couldn't get the time off work. However, in a nice moment, he is watching it on his phone during his lunch break. Ichigo and Orihime are revealed to not only be married, but have a son, Kazui. And at the same time, Rukia and Renji arrive, and it's revealed that they too are now married and have a daughter called Ichika. As everyone comes together, though, something is amiss. In the Soul Society, Byakuya, Soifon, and Mayuri are checking out Yhwach's resurgent spirit energy, when suddenly a swirling black mass that resembles Yhwach's Soul King power suddenly surges. That same power begins to manifest in Kazui's bedroom as well, as Yhwach prepares to make good on the threat that he left Ichigo and the others with back when he was in Varvelt and leaving for the Serete. Even though Ichigo killed him when he had been robbed of the Almighty, Yhwach is somehow still able to launch an attack on Ichigo and his friends in the far-flung future, when they're at their happiest. I'm not going to dive into the logistics of this today, but suffice it to say that I'm not really sure this makes any sense. Yhwach would have had to have launched this attack prior to having been robbed of his power and then killed as a normal human, or as normal a human as Yhwach can feasibly be. If the Almighty was available for Yhwach to use in this capacity, then why didn't he just resurrect himself from death once again? But anyway, we're not going to get into that right now. However, before Yhwach can strike, Kazui somehow snuffs out the remnant of his power in Karakura Town, and in doing so completely destroys what was left of the Quincy King in one fell swoop, before we briefly return to the past to learn Yhwach's motivation at the end of the war. In the present day, as a newly re-imprisoned Aizen leaves us with one final monologue, Kazui meets Ichika in a reflection of the very first chapter of Bleach and Ichigo's meeting with Rukia. And that was it. That was the end of the Bleach manga. So, what were the biggest problems with this ending? What were the issues people had with how it was presented, and how can the anime fix it? What is the anime already doing, and what has it already done? It's funny, I actually have a live first read reaction video to chapter 686 here on the channel from 2016, which is very weird to look back on now. It's like a time capsule to a totally different period of my life. But I also vividly remember writing down more detailed thoughts regarding the ending on the day the final chapter released after making that reaction video. Once I'd had some time to process my thoughts, read through the chapter again a few times over, and lo and behold, I've actually managed to find those notes. I never released the video that I guess I was planning on making, but they were written on August the 18th, 2016, which I believe was the actual day the chapter released, and among these notes I had written out a list of just some of the things that I was disappointed that we didn't see, not just in the ending but in the Thousand Year Blood War arc specifically, and would likely never see, now that the manga had come to a close, and here is just some of them. A backstory for the Soul King, a flashback to the first Shinigami and Quincy War from 1,000 years ago, the namesake of the final arc. Bankai for Ukitake, Shinji, Love, and the Zero Division, though for some reason I've written that I think there's still a chance we could get Ishin's Bankai, which I don't really know where that was coming from, it makes no sense to me. I'm assuming it was based on the fact that Ishin's Bankai was made explicit mention of during the Thousand Year Blood War arc, but that's kind of weird. A backstory for the Zero Division, Fullbringer involvement in the war, by which I really meant Ginjo and Tsukishima, Harabel's involvement in the war in any capacity, Aizen's role in the story, and Kisuke and Yoruichi's backstory. There were obviously more points than that, but clearly those were what were on my mind at the time, and really, for me at least, this encapsulates the crux of the issue I had with the ending at the time. I personally, as I mentioned in my most controversial moments video, wasn't really fussed about the relationships or anything like that, which is where a lot of the more extreme anger was coming from in the immediate aftermath. But for me personally, I was most disappointed by everything and everyone that was missing, by everything that it felt would never be known or shown. It felt like there was a gaping hole gnawing away at the center of the final arc, and by extension Bleach itself. Obviously there's all the big picture stuff that I just mentioned, and a lot of that is big picture stuff, but on top of that there were serious world building and lore questions left totally untouched, effectively meaning the status of the world at the end of the series was completely in flux, that it made no sense. What happened to the Soul King? If the Soul King was dead, and he was, we knew him to be, we saw him die and be absorbed by Yhwach, and now Yhwach was dead, how was the universe even still going? How was it intact? This was what we'd been fighting over, apparently, for almost 100 chapters at this point, and yet with the aftermath skipped over, it was just, well, okay, the world is somehow fine, we have no idea how. But on top of those more macro issues, there were just so many smaller problems as well that all kind of added up to make something that felt even worse in many ways than those bigger lore-related questions. Characters who had gone completely missing, or whose development arcs felt totally underserved in the end. Kisuke Urahara, one of the most iconic and important characters in Bleach, was last seen in the manga in chapter 666, collapsing unconscious in a pool of his own blood. The fact that not even a page was spared to check in on the Urahara shop in the epilogue was completely baffling to me, as it left the fates of so many characters totally up in the air. Were they likely to be alive? Was it likely that Nell had managed to rescue them? Sure, but it didn't sit right that such fan-favourite, and more importantly, vital characters were left in a sort of Schrödinger state forevermore. And what about Waco Mundo? The Oranka were totally missing from the epilogue as well, including Harabel, who hadn't been seen since chapter 485, and that's currently still the same here in the anime. Regarding development arcs, so Chad was now a prize-winning boxer? This seemingly went completely against everything this character was supposed to represent. A super strong human who was never to use his fists for violence was now using them for financial gain? In a way that is, by the way, basically cheating. I mean, how could he ever lose to ordinary humans? Of course, Kubo has come out and actually addressed this in recent years, but back in the day, very, very weird. Meanwhile, there was Uryu. Even after giving everything in the Thousand Year Blood War arc in pursuit of his plan, in pursuit of trying to protect those that he cared about, in pursuit of trying to avenge his mother, he wasn't able to reconnect with his friends in this final chapter either. Hell, even on the colour page spread, his back is turned from them. It was really weird, and after everything, Uryu was never allowed a moment of downtime with his friends back on their side. Not only that, but speaking of the Quincy, the Vandenreich and the wider Quincy race had seemingly been obliterated. Once again, the Quincy's were just Uryu and his father. We somehow returned to the status quo. We'd eventually learn, of course, that the Bambis and a select few others had survived, but in the immediate aftermath, it looked very bleak for the Quincy race yet again. Considering there were discussions surrounding whether or not the war was just at the start of the arc, trying to paint both sides as morally grey, everything had seemingly ended in a one-sided bloodbath, as though the narrative had simply decided that the Quincy race didn't deserve to stick around in the end. And I get it, the Sternritter and by extension the Vandenreich as a whole were really the worst of the worst in many respects, but that opens up a wider question about nuance in the final arc, especially since that does seem to be what Kubo was maybe aiming for initially, to some degree anyway, with the Shinigami wondering whether they were on the side of justice or not. Although, considering the Vandenreich were very clearly based on Nazi Germany, it's hard to see how we were ever really supposed to take their side in the narrative. And of course, you can't mention the Quincy without mentioning Yhwach, and his defeat was, again, very, very controversial. The Still Silver was enormously controversial at the time. I've always been on record saying that I don't mind it thematically as an idea. I think it works quite well. It simply needed to be integrated better into the story. It needed to be foreshadowed at least at some point before finally being used. And there are still existing questions around how it actually was able to be pulled off in the first place, considering Yhwach's seemingly all-encompassing ability. Again, something I hope the anime will address. But more than the way Yhwach was defeated was the issue of his motivation, or complete lack of any real coherent motivation until chapter 686, which is kind of absurd. After all of that, there were still many problems. Ishin was missing, Ryuken was missing, the Fullbringers were missing. As far as the epilogue was concerned, things looked pretty bad, and worst of all, bare bones. But of course, the issues with the ending started earlier than this. Truthfully, the problematic epilogue was just a symptom of problems that had grown entrenched over really the last 6 months or so prior to the manga ending, presumably when Kubo was really starting to struggle. Again, as I mentioned earlier, I was quite a naive yet staunch believer in both Bleach and Kubo, and I didn't really feel that there were any significant issues in the story that couldn't yet be fixed pretty much up until the writing was on the wall. Pretty much up until Ichigo began fighting Yhwach, and even then I thought that maybe this wasn't the final battle. In fact, that thought was reinforced in my head when Ichigo's bankai was broken. I thought, okay, that's a cool twist. We're not going to see Ichigo's true bankai just yet. We're going to dial back, take some more time, fill in some more blanks, and then regroup, maybe a few volumes down the line, for what was going to be the real final battle. I'm ready to admit that there was no part of me that even thought we were less than 10 chapters from the end at the time, and I know that I wasn't alone in that belief either. As seems to be the case with a lot of long-running serialized manga, the ending came out of almost nowhere and hit the community like a ton of bricks. If I remember correctly, it was when chapter 680 rolled around that reality kind of set in a pretty hard and brutal way. Bleach had a colour page that week that explicitly teased, for the first time since the announcement really that this was the final arc, the end of the series, and I recall being caught completely off guard. That was the first time Bleach ending felt like a genuine reality, and not just a reality, but an imminent one too. The colour page featuring Yhwach said something like, Bleach is ending in blank chapters, and they blacked out the number, but even then I remember thinking, along with the community, that we were maybe 20, 30 chapters from the end, that there was maybe 2 or 3 volumes still to go. When in reality, that blacked out number was 5. And I can't remember how exactly, but people managed to uncover the number in the week following that chapter coming out, and I recall just being in disbelief. I was like, there's just no way. Not there's no way it's ending this soon, but there's no way this is going to end well. At this point, there was no way this was going to end satisfactorily. And it's funny too, because again, looking back at chapter 680 now, that is the chapter that things start to go off the rails in a very big way. That's the chapter that features Yhwach using another Alsvalen out of nowhere to take out both Gerard and Hashwolf. And I remember reading that and thinking, oh no, this is happening. This is how we're going to reach the ending quickly. And that reality kind of kept setting in week after week. It was the next week when Ryuken showed up with the still silver arrow, which was the very first time we'd ever heard of it. And thus Yhwach's defeat was set into motion, mere chapters before it actually happened. And don't get me wrong, there's plenty of cool stuff in these last few chapters. Ginjo and Tsukishima, characters I had been waiting since chapter 518 to see, did finally show up. Aizen began fighting Yhwach, which was really incredible. That was awesome. That was like a dream come true scenario. It's just the pacing suddenly exploded and the countdown was well and truly on at that point. Aizen had a role in the 1,000-Year Blood War arc. He had a role in the final arc so far, but I was very disappointed that there wasn't more to it than what we got, and that kind of goes doubly so for Ginjo and Tsukishima. It was cool that Tsukishima actively helped Ichigo overcome Yhwach's the Almighty in a way no other character could, in a way that felt planned out. Like Tsukishima's Book of the End, when you sat down and realized actually this does really work as a counter to this otherwise omniscient power. That was awesome. But Ginjo could have not been there at all, and nothing would have changed, which I was very sad about. Is it cool development for Ginjo's character that he wanted to kind of pay Ichigo back? I guess so. But it's such a fleeting moment that there was no real payoff. So yeah, that was the tumultuous nature of those last few chapters. Those final few weeks of reading the manga, it was undeniably a ride. The sad part was that it simply never felt as though Kubo was able to truly recognize his vision for the end of the series. Even if the very final chapter was as he always intended it to one degree or another, the anime absolutely now has given him and is giving him the chance to deliver on what he always wanted. And so how can the anime fix the ending? Well, it's funny to look back on the issues that I outlined now and see what's actually already changed in the wake of the manga's ending. Obviously, the light novels gave us Shinji's bankai, and the anime gave us one of the additional missing Zero Division bankai, plus better looks at two of their shikai as well. And back then I certainly never would have imagined getting any of that Zero Division stuff. The anime has also given us a look at that original war from 1,000 years ago, and even some of the surrounding context to that escalating tension as well, the namesake of the final arc. Plus it seems, optimistically, like it might actually be preparing that much-needed flashback for Adnias too. Still what I want to see the most from Cour 4, even if we don't actually get that, if we don't get the substantial look at the primordial era that I'm hoping for, there's already more here than there ever was in the manga, and more than I could have ever hoped for. Not only that, but the anime has already put in an enormous amount of work to help fix the deeper, more systemic issues surrounding the ending. It might not seem like it, but again, as I mentioned earlier, the ending is just a product of the much wider problems that began to affect the series, and so throughout Cour 3 especially, the groundwork was already being laid to help course correct the narrative. From smaller points like the still silver arrow being foreshadowed, and the Vizard seemingly being given the chance to actually do something this time, to much larger changes, like essentially the rewriting of Yhwach's entire character to make him more coherent, to give him an actual motivation, points that I was harping on about during even the earlier episodes of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc anime. All of that has now come to fruition, really thanks to Cour 3, and Uryu's entire arc being reworked as well, including what appears to be the reason for his surviving the Alsvalen in the first place, which was another key detail completely omitted from the manga, despite being set up earlier. and his motivation as well for trying to destroy the Vandenreich being tied much more intimately to both his grandfather Soken and his pride as a Quincy, one who wishes to protect the innocent. While I'm sure Uryu still wishes to avenge his mother's death, ultimately his new motivation is born out of his belief system as we have known it up until this very point, and that ultimately makes it considerably more satisfying. It's not that Uryu has any issues with the Quincy specifically, and why would he really? It's that he knows that as a Quincy, he should be protecting those who can't protect themselves, and that Yhwach, and by extension the Vandenreich, these extremists, well, they're not doing that. They're not looking out for the living world's best interests, the humans' best interests. They want to destroy everything, to rewrite the world, to rebuild a Quincy nation above everything else, and Uryu's going to do what he can to ensure that doesn't come to pass. But what else can the anime do in the short term to really help seal the deal and deliver, not only on Kubo's vision for the 1,000-year Blood War arc, but on what the community wants to see from the end of Bleach as well? Well, again, even in the immediate future, there is still stuff that can be done. For starters, give characters more to do. A potentially brand new battle was already teased for the Vizard, as they all, and I mean all, came together for the first time since the fake Karakura Town arc to take on Gerard. But what about Isshin and Ryuken, who have arrived in Varvelt a whole 10 chapters earlier than they did in the manga? What about Chad and Ganju, who, based on the trailer, seem destined still to languish fighting statues off-screen? And what about Uryu, who deserves an actual fleshed-out battle with Hashwolf? Have a small subplot where Grimjo and Neliel break Harabel out of a Varvelt prison, to give the Iran cast some actual relevance. There are certain areas that I think will be difficult to substantially change this late in the game. Aizen, for example, feels like he will play probably the exact same role in Cour 4 as he did in the manga, which is fine, but there's got to be room for some embellishment. If the anime team really wanted to go out with a bang, then a bankai reveal from Aizen during his final showdown with Yhwach would really set the community on fire. Considering the amount of additional space they've freed up for themselves, it seems the anime is going to have to be able to use, once reported to be as much as 6 episodes of new content, so effectively half of the entire season, which maybe is a little hard to pass. That's an unbelievably long time in regards to the fact there's no reason why we can't see much more from characters who did feel ultimately underserved. Again, like Aizen, it is difficult to see how the anime can change or expand upon the roles of characters like Ginjo and Tsukishima this late in the game, who really only showed up for one pivotal scene that cannot really be changed, and then vanished once again. What I mean is there's really only one place for them to go. But at the same time, I legitimately wouldn't be surprised if Yhwach unleashes an army of his Soul King empowered Soldat, as we randomly saw in Cour 3, or hell, if we really want to swing for the fences, his resurrected Stern Ritter upon the Gotei 13 and their allies as he flees Varvelt to ensure they don't follow him. Meaning we could see an extra big battle royale break out, one last hurrah for the various side characters. If I were in charge of the anime, I would do something like that. And well, considering the route they seem to be going down with the Vizard, I can't help but hope that the anime team is committed to giving everyone their chance to shine, even just a little bit. And then when it comes to the epilogue itself, those 2 crucial final chapters. On the opposite side of all of this, once we get to the very end, the key thing the anime needs to do is to close the loop. Ensure that no character is left unaccounted for. That means showing the fates of everyone where possible. Kisuke, Grimjo, Yoroichi, Isshin, Ryuken, Harabel, Neliel, and more. A great way to do this would be to, as I've advocated for before, animate the prologue to Can't Fear Your Own World, which feels like a slam dunk way to close out the anime before wrapping things up with a neat little bow with chapter 685 and 686 10 years later. Show the Allied forces parting ways in the immediate aftermath of the war, once Yhwach has been dealt with, show the downtime as everyone finally gets a chance to breathe now that the war is over. While we're at it, this should give us the chance to see the fate of the Soul King of Yhwach as he now stands. And so, speaking of the actual epilogue itself, look, honestly, I don't think too much is likely to change here, specifically regarding those final 2 chapters, mostly because the way these chapters shape up will be defined by what precedes them. You know, if Core 4 is substantially different, like in a really crazy way, then we can expect the epilogue to change as well. I just don't anticipate that being the case. As I have repeatedly said, since before the anime even aired, I didn't ever expect them to change the actual story beats of the Thousand Year Blood War arc itself. Everything surrounding them, sure, that's fair game. But the actual story beats, no matter how controversial, were always going to be the same, and so far that has proved to be right. And I don't see any reason why that wouldn't continue in Core 4. I think every major plot beat that happens in Core 4 will be the same. And ultimately, for the most part, the core plot beats were never really the issue. It was just everything that surrounded them, the context that they were packaged within. That was where the issues were found. And the same is true of the very end as well. I mean, you'll never be able to please the people who weren't happy with who ended up with who, but again, it's so superfluous in a series like Bleach, that's simply never bothered me. And again, that's who I thought was going to end up with who anyway. It's funny too, because perceptions towards Kazui and Ichika, who obviously are the big new additions to the cast at the very end of the series, the final 2 new characters, perception towards them has changed, I would say fairly dramatically, thanks to the Hell chapter. Because originally they were kind of introduced, they felt like cookie-cutter versions of Ichigo and Orihime smashed together, of Renji and Rukia smashed together. They had no real defining identities of their own. And I think that going back to chapter 686, that is still pretty accurate, I would say. They are fairly inoffensive but also uninteresting composite characters who only really exist to act as a passing of the torch as the story comes to an end. However, they become real characters thanks to the Hell chapter. And so I think people are going to be way more excited to finally actually see these guys in action. On one hand, because the future is potentially bright for them, but on the other, because thanks to that new chapter, we do actually know them at least a little bit better, and they are stepping in to roles and shoes of their own. Would it be nice to get more from characters like Chad and Uryu? Absolutely. Is that going to happen? I really don't know. I can't say. That's a difficult one. I'd like to think so. I mean, Chad, hopefully we get a lot more from in general, although the trailer, a little bit iffy on that. I'm not entirely sure what route they're going to go down with him. It might just be the exact same as the manga currently. And so, yeah, would I like to see more from him in the finale? Definitely. And it's possible that that might change. It all depends on what Kubo really wants from the end of the series. If he's happy with where the characters ended up at the end of the manga, or if not, then things will change. But the reality is, chapters 685 and 686 had such a huge impact on the community, on the reader base, but in reality, they are tiny. They cover such tiny portions of time in the Bleach story. The real issue, of course, is that they are the final thing we ever saw in the manga, so they had the lasting impression. Again, I don't think they're going to change that much, but I'd be totally open to being proven wrong. So look, to be honest, there is a lot the anime both needs to do and can do to help realise Kubo's vision all the more, and essentially help to cap off a brand new era of Bleach. And what better way to do that than to totally change that which left a lasting and, yes, bitter taste in people's mouths, the ending. What better way to see us into hopefully a new and bright future for the series in the wake of the Thousand Year Blood War Arc anime than to give people a new springboard, a new final lasting impression? To be honest, I think a big percentage of the work has already been done, and the foundations have already been set. If the end of the war isn't so jarring, if it isn't so abrupt, if it feels like the payoff is earned and satisfying, and if that then leads nicely and neatly into both the aftermath of the war and then the Can't For Your Own World prologue, That setup makes the epilogue that bit more palatable, and I think it will end in a much better place, well, than it did in 2016. To be totally honest, it does kind of feel like the Thousand Year Blood War Arc anime has conjured so much well-earned goodwill already that they would really have to mess things up in Core 4 to upset people now. I just don't see that happening. Maybe that's me being naive again. Maybe that's my old 2016 self re-emerging, but I think there's a lot to be optimistic about regarding Bleach these days, and I'm very excited. On one hand, I'm not excited because I don't want the anime to end, but I am very excited to see how it changes, what changes they include, and how, hopefully, they do fix Bleach's ending for the future to come. Alright everyone, but that's it for today's video. As always, I do hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you took something of value away from it as well. Let me know your thoughts on the ending of the Bleach manga. Were you there in 2016 like me? Did you have some kind of experience with it? I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. If you're a new fan, if you're a newer reader, let me know your thoughts and feelings on the ending. Did you have your expectations for the ending shaped by those who had come before? Or if not, again, I'd love to know your thoughts down in the comments below. How do you think the anime is going to fix things? Do you think the anime has already made leaps and bounds towards fixing the ending? Again, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. I'd love to read them all. Alright everyone, once again, thank you so very much for watching. Consider hitting subscribe if you haven't done already. It does make a huge difference in helping get this channel to 300,000 subs by the end of the year. That would be absolutely wonderful, and again, it would be greatly appreciated. Check out the Patreon as well if you want to support the channel that extra step further. Get all of the videos completely free of YouTube ads and get a shout out in every single video as well. Again, it does mean everything I do. Greatly appreciate it. Alright guys, but until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.